Good evening. Welcome to the third talk in our Autumn-Winter 2020-21 lecture series. We're live tonight from the museum's Georgian Assembly Room. Tonight's speaker is the historian Brian Walker, Professor Emeritus of Irish Studies at Queen's University and a member of the Church of Ireland Centenaries Committee. Brian has published widely on many aspects of Irish history, including his most recent book, Irish History Matters: Politics, Identities and Commemoration. In his talk tonight, Professor Walker will explore the issues of anniversaries, centenaries and commemoration in Ireland from 1798 through to 2021 and the birth of Northern Ireland, and he'll reflect on our changing response to remembering. If you have any questions, then please use YouTube's chat function and we'll pose them to Brian. So please welcome Professor Brian Walker.
I am delighted to speak here this evening. I have two main reasons for my enthusiasm for the event. First, I'm a resident of the Lisburn and Castlereagh District Council area. However, my connections with this part of the world go back much further. My grandmother lived in Pond Park in Lisburn, and as a child, I enjoyed regular trips to see her and my uncle and three aunts who lived with her. Two of my aunts ran Jusina's Ladies' Clothes Shop in Castle Street for over 3 decades. Often we'd call in to see my aunt before we went to visit my grandmother. My father would park the car, the children and my mother would run in, and then my father would suddenly run in and go into a little storeroom at the back. The reason being he was a clergyman, and in the 1950s it was felt to be a little inappropriate for a clergyman with a clerical collar on to be in a ladies' clothes shop. Anyway, my aunts eventually moved to Hillhall, also within the Lisburn area. There's a second reason why I'm pleased to speak here tonight. I think this is a very important series of lectures. I congratulate the museum staff in organising the programme. I commend the council for their support for this excellent museum. Over the last 8 years, the museum has run a fascinating selection of exhibitions and events to do with the decade of centenaries. They cover the Ulster Covenant, 1916, the Rising and the Somme, Armistice Day, and then most recently a Swansea exhibition. It is good that we can approach these events in an effort to gain a fair perspective on our history. My talk is titled Centenaries, 1920 to 3, Commemorations, Conflict and Conciliation. In the past, commemorations or anniversaries of historical events have often been occasions of discord and conflict. Referring to the 1960s, Sir Kenneth Bloomfield, a former head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, wrote, and I quote, "Anniversaries are the curse of Ireland. Like saints' days, the dates of historically resonant events punctuate the Northern Ireland calendar, calling for an orgy of reminiscence, celebration and demonstration from some section or other of the population." End of quote. He continued, "It does not seem to matter that some of these demonstrations annoy or infuriate other people. This is indeed, for some at least of the participants, a principal attraction." End of quote. It has been argued that the passion and confrontation aroused by commemorations, especially in 1966, was one of the factors to destabilise society and to lead to the outbreak of the Troubles. By the 1990s, however, there was a sustained effort to deal with commemorations in a more inclusive and less confrontational way. I want to show and explain how this happened, looking in particular at the 1798 bicentenary in 1998, and also World War commemorations. These changes had an important conciliatory effect. I will next look at the decade of centenaries from 1913 to 23, concentrating especially on the tumultuous years 1920 to 3, with their sharply contested and violent events. I will be concerned not just with Lisburn, but also with the wider context. I would like to begin with some comments on my background and explaining why I have an interest in commemorations. I have mentioned the 1798 rebellion and its bicentenary in 1998, which I shall be looking at briefly. I spent some of my childhood, from the age of 5 to 12, in Ballynahinch, where the Battle of that name was fought in 1798. But I knew nothing about the event. I think there were two reasons for this. First, I lived in the rectory. My father was the Church of Ireland rector in Ballynahinch. I suspect that if I'd lived in the next door Presbyterian manse, the home of our good friends, the Reverend Cahoon and his family, I would have known about it. However, there's a second, and I think more important reason why I was never told about it, certainly not by my father. Less than a decade before coming to Ballynahinch, my father, as an army chaplain, had taken part in D-Day 1 landings on the 6th of June 1944 and participated in the Battle for Normandy, the greatest battle ever fought in Western Europe. He never ever talked about his experiences then and had a strong aversion to wars or battles, which may explain why I was not told about the Battle of Ballynahinch. I then went as a boarder to Campbell College. Now, until the 1960s, there was little Irish history taught in state schools. However, in the 1990s, in the 1960s, a new course was taught on Henry Grattan and his times in 19th century Ireland, which included the 1798 rebellion. The course was taught with great enthusiasm by history teacher Dr. Liam Barber. Liam was also the Presbyterian chaplain. This gave me a deep interest in Irish history, and I decided to study history at university. I spent 2 years at Magee College, Derry, Londonderry, and then 2 years at Trinity College, Dublin, to complete a degree in modern history and political science. I stayed on at Trinity in the early 1970s to study for a PhD on politics in Ulster in the late 19th century. With my interest in political history, I ended up as a lecturer in the politics school at Queen's University. This career in the politics school was a valuable experience for me. I hope my students got some benefit. Besides political history, Irish political history, I also had to teach comparative politics and the politics of deeply divided societies. This allowed me to approach Irish history and politics in a comparative way, which gave me new insights. I found out that other societies have been and are impacted by cleavages over nationality and religion as we are. Our problems are not unique. Others have faced similar difficulties to us in their history. In the early 1920s, many other parts of Europe experienced problems to do with the formation of new states and with internal ethnic, religious, or language divisions as part of these new societies. In the later part of my talk, I want to view some of the developments here in a comparative light. By the 1990s, however, I had moved to become director of the Interdisciplinary Institute of Irish Studies at Queen's University. My interest in history continued, but now I became involved in studying how ideas of the past, historical myths, and how we remember the past have impacted on society for good or ill. This led me to work on commemorations, on how we recall important events from our history. And I want to turn to commemorations. Commemorations is a subject, of course, which I deal with in my new book. It's called Irish History Matters, Politics, Identities, and Commemoration. In the past, as I've already remarked, commemorations or anniversaries of historical events have often been occasions of discord and conflict in our society. By the 1990s, however, there was a sustained effort to deal with commemorations in a more inclusive and less confrontational way. There were two important factors behind this change. First, new Irish historical writing challenged various historical myths and sought to provide a scholarly and non-partisan treatment of Irish history. Popular histories, such as Jonathan Barden's book, A History of Ulster, first published in 1992, provided valuable historical insights for a wider audience. Secondly, there was a new awareness among both politicians and members of the public of the often baneful effect of historical myths. There was an effort by many to draw either a different or more inclusive lesson from history. The outcome of these changes was that in 1998, the bicentenary of the 1798 rebellion in Ireland was commemorated widely, north and south, as a shared historical event. This contrasted with the partisan manner in which the event had been commemorated a century earlier. Marion Elliott's book, Wolfe Tone, published in 1989, and Tony Stewart's book, The Summer Soldiers, the 1798 Rebellion in Antrim and Down, published in 1995, helped to lay the ground for this new approach. During 1998, well-attended exhibitions and talks were held in many museums, such as in Lisburn, which explored the complexities of this historical episode. I spoke at one such event, organised by the Reverend Brian Kennaway, who was Presbyterian minister at Crumlin and also convener of the Education Committee of the Orange Order. In the 1990s, this committee sought not only to promote its own history, but also to build bridges with other communities. They were keen that the 1798 rebellion should be celebrated in a, I quote, a non-sectarian, inclusive way, end of quote. Brian and his committee organised a formal dinner at Parliament buildings at Stormont to commemorate the 1798 rebellion. Now, Brian rang me up. I knew him from McGee, and he said he'd like me to speak, and he said this would be an important inclusive event. Well, I have to say, I didn't know what he meant by inclusive. Did he mean it would be inclusive of brethren from Antrim and Orange brethren from Fermanagh? Well, I agreed to talk, and in the event, it was quite remarkable. It was a remarkably important and inclusive event. Present was the Lord Mayor of Dublin, the Lord Mayor of Belfast. Guests included the heads of most of the universities in Ireland and the editors of the main newspapers, including the Irish Times and the Belfast Telegraph. I gave the after-dinner speech. I tried to draw out the complexities of the situation of the 1798 rebellion in the north. And then in my conclusion, I observed that we were very close to the bicentenary of the Battle of Ballynahinch. So to illustrate the complexities of these events, I closed by making a comment in honour and respect of those who'd been at Ballynahinch 200 years ago. I said we were on the eve of the Battle of Ballynahinch. I then said we should remember the brave Presbyterian United Irishmen who fought and died for a new Ireland. I also said we should remember the Catholic soldiers of the Monaghan militia who fought and died to save Ireland for the crown. Well, I'm glad to say my speech seemed to go down well, both with the Orange Brethren and all our special guests. Another very different event to do with 1798 was recorded in the Irish Times on the 13th of June 1998, and it also involved the Reverend Brian Kennaway. The paper reported how recently a party of some 60 Catholics and 40 Presbyterians from Crumlin visited the Ulster Museum to view the exhibition Up in Arms about the 98 rebellion. They were led by Brian and Catholic priest Father David Delargy. The visit came after the shocking murder of a young Catholic student, Kieran Heffron from Crumlin. Brian explained to the reporter that as they sought ways to convey their solidarity to his family and their Catholic neighbours. He was struck by the possibilities of a visit to the exhibition. He said, "I thought of it as something we could do together, something that would compromise no principles, theological or otherwise, something that offered a shared history." This time also saw important changes in the commemoration of all those from Ireland who died in the First World War. Originally, after 1918, there had been widespread commemoration of the war dead. Eventually, due to political developments, this ceased to be the case. By the 1980s in the South, there was little evidence of such commemorations. Kevin Myers described the Irish National War Memorial at Island Bridge in Dublin in 1979 as, I quote, "a vandalised tiphead." In the North, nationalists tend to ignore this event, while unionists tend to emphasise the importance of the 36th Ulster Division to the neglect of others. Important developments now occurred from the late 1980s. Again, new historical writing and changes in public opinion were important factors. The works of historians, writers, and journalists drew attention to this neglected part of Irish history. In particular, the writings of Jane Leonard and Keith Jeffrey examined commemorations and the fate of veterans north and south. There was also a concern for change among the public at large, including politicians. Public outrage at the 11 deaths caused by an IRA bomb at the War Memorial in Enniskillen on Remembrance Sunday on the 8th of November 1987 caused many in the Republic to think again about the Irish war dead. People wanted to learn the history of these events which had been hidden from them in the past. In the South, war memorials were restored and new memorials erected. The Irish National War Memorial at Island Bridge was restored by the Irish government and reopened officially in 1994 by Fianna Fáil Minister Bertie Ahern. These events often involved reconciliatory and pluralist aspects. The Island of Ireland Peace Park in Messine was opened on the 11th of November 1998, attended by the British, Irish and Belgian heads of state and large numbers of people from all over Ireland. This was the result of a cross-border initiative led by Glenn Barr and Paddy Hart, who sought not only to remember those forgotten soldiers, but to promote reconciliation. At this event they declared, and I quote, they declared that a fitting tribute to the principles for which men and women from the island of Ireland died in both world wars would be permanent peace in Ireland. End of quote. Nationalist and Republican politicians now joined unionists at commemorative events in Northern Ireland to remember the World War dead. Ulster Unionist councillor Dr. Ian Adamson was the leading light in the establishment at Newtownards, County Down in 1994 of the Somme Heritage Centre. Its purpose was to remember specifically all soldiers from Ireland, not only members of the 36th Ulster Division who died at the Somme. In 2007, the first official meeting of the Irish President, Mary McAleese, and Northern Ireland First Minister, the Reverend Ian Paisley, took place at the Somme Museum to open an exhibition on the mainly Unionist 36th Ulster Division and the mainly Nationalist 16th Irish Division. On that occasion, Ian Paisley declared, "Mary McAleese and myself have come here to pay tribute in unity to all those who fought and died for us. There may have been division then, but not now." Do such commemorations and ideas of shared history make a difference? Do they engender respect and reconciliation? There's evidence that they do. In his memoirs published in 2009, Bertie Ahern stated, and I quote, "Respect for our shared history was one of the ways that we were trying to build a shared future north and south. It was something that, probably to the surprise of both of us, Ian Paisley and I agreed about. It would turn out to be an important factor in implementing the Good Friday Agreement." End of quote. After hearing of Ahern's resignation in 2008, Ian Paisley singled out Ahern's willingness to acknowledge the role of Irish soldiers in 2 world wars as an important reason for his respect for him. Such developments, it should be noted, affected not just the politicians but also the general public. People wanted to discover and tell the stories of their own families in these events and were willing to embrace ideas of shared history. Now, however, we come to the decade of centenaries, which covers the period 1913 to 23. This has presented special challenges. The picture so far reveals that commemoration of events involving a sense of shared history has remained important. At the same time, there have been historical events over which people do not agree and for which a shared sense of history is not possible. How do we deal with such events? How do we handle these matters? So far, I'm glad to say, there's been reasonable success in dealing with these events which have the potential to deepen divisions. Commemoration of the 1916 Easter Rising in 2016 provided a challenge. This event, however, was handled with care by the Irish government. It avoided the triumphalism of the 1966 celebrations, but still provided a dignified commemoration of this key moment for the founding of the new Irish state. There were some elements of inclusion, such as the presence of the British ambassador in the viewing stand for the parade in O'Connell Street, and the erection of a wall of remembrance at Glasnevin Cemetery, which gave the names of all who died during the Rising: Irish and British, military, police, civilians, all are mentioned on this wall of remembrance. This could not have happened in 1966. Of course, not everyone agreed with these events. Many Unionists did not. Previously, DUP leader and First Minister Arlene Foster had denounced the 1916 Rising as an attack on the state and democracy. But she set a good example of showing respect to others. She attended a talk on the Rising by historians at Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin, organised by the Church of Ireland Centenaries Committee. I'm now on that committee, although I wasn't in 2016. At that meeting, she insisted that what she was attending was not a commemoration, which she would not go to, but an historical lecture or reflective evening. She expressed hope that by attending, she had, and I quote, set a tone of respect, a tone of tolerance, a tone of respecting differences as well. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing the different perspectives. End of quote. This could not have happened in 1966. Commemoration of those who died in the First World War continued to reflect a sense of shared history and to promote reconciliation. In June 2017, there were major events at Messines to mark the centenary of the battle of that name. One such event involved the Redmond and Meek families. Captain Willie Redmond, the Nationalist MP of the 16th Irish Division from County Wexford, was wounded in the first hour of that battle. But he was rescued by Private John Meek of the 36th Ulster Division from County Antrim, who tried to carry him back behind the lines. Meek was wounded himself, but stayed with Redmond until stretcher bearers from the 36th Ulster Division arrived and brought him to their aid post, where he was looked after by a Church of Ireland chaplain, the Reverend John Redmond, before he died that night. This is the same John Redmond who in 1920 would be vicar of Ballymacarrett, and something of a legend, because in the riots of July, August 1920, he went out into the streets to try and stop loyalist rioting. I've written about him in an archive on the RCB Library website, and it's a very interesting story. I might say that John Meek survived the battle. He was given a military medal. He returned then in 1918 to County Antrim, but died sadly in 1923 from tuberculosis. It was too late for a Commonwealth grave. He's buried in an unmarked grave. Curiously, beside him where his brother lay, it was a Commonwealth grave stone. But because he died in 1923, that was too late for such a stone. And so he lay in this unmarked grave until a couple of years ago when locals got together and raised money to put a gravestone on his grave. In 2017, a small ceremony was held at Uiscut in Belgium to unveil a memorial depicting John Meek carrying Willie Redmond off the battlefield. It was attended by the Redmond and Meek families. There were a small number of guests present. They included Enda Kenny, Taoiseach of the Irish Republic, His Royal Highness, the Duke of Cambridge of the United Kingdom, and Her Royal Highness, Princess Astrid of Belgium. On Remembrance Sunday, Armistice Day, centenary this year, in 2018, I was in Enniskillen. You may have heard Enniskillen is in the papers today. They had a first. A lady from Enniskillen of the age of 90 who now lives in England is the first person to get a vaccine. Well, in 1918, they were first as well in something else. On the morning of the 11th of November, 1918, an alert telephonist in the barracks in Enniskillen, the army barracks in Enniskillen, picked up a message from Marshal Foch to all his commanders at the front. Now, I don't know why he was listening in to the words of the commander. It was a Morse code message. But the message said, at 11 o'clock this morning, the war will end. So he went and got his commanding officer out of bed. His commanding officer then went and got the rector out of bed, and the bells rang. The bells rang in Enniskillen at 8 o'clock in the morning, 2 hours before they rang in London. Anyway, I was there in 2018 on that day in Enniskillen, and it was a very impressive event. At the cenotaph, wreaths were laid by DUP leader Arlene Foster and Irish Government Minister Heather Humphreys. The parade to the cathedral included not only members of the Royal British Legion, but also a large contingent of former Irish Army members in their blue United Nations berets. This could not have happened 50 years ago. Finally, I want to consider the period 1920 to 23, which undoubtedly brings special problems. Events of this time include the War of Independence, the Government of Ireland Act, partition, the establishment of Northern Ireland, the Anglo-Irish Treaty, the establishment of the Irish Free State, the violence in Northern Ireland, January to June 1922, and the Irish Civil War, June 1922 to May 1923. All these were and are matters of controversy. Considerable violence accompanied many of these events. However, I believe there are reasons why I think these matters will be handled more sensitively than would have been the case in the past. First, there are various agencies and groups whose work will help prevent such commemorations descend into discord and confrontation. The decade of commemorations in Northern Ireland will continue to benefit from the efforts of the Heritage Lottery Fund and the Community Relations Council, who promoted conferences and publications to, and I quote, promote a balanced understanding of difficult history using the historical facts and drawing on different narratives, end of quote. The Public Record Office of Northern Ireland is another important source of exhibition and conferences on these events. The Northern Ireland Office has established a Centenary Historical Advisory Panel chaired by Lord Bew to give advice to the government on historical matters around the establishment of Northern Ireland. There are other reasons which should help us deal with future contentious centenary issues over the next 2 years. We have the benefit of a number of specialised studies which cover this period. Brian Walker's book, A State Under Siege, The Establishment of Northern Ireland 1920-25, was published in 1995, but is available again. Alan Parkinson's book, Belfast and Holy Wars, which deals with the impact of violence on the citizens of Belfast, 1920-22, was published in 2004. He has expanded this work to a broader study called A Difficult Birth, The Early Years of Northern Ireland, 1920-25, published this year. Pierce Lawler's book, The Burnings, 1920, which deals with events in Lisburn, was published in 2009, but is now available in a revised edition. Other valuable studies have appeared this year. As well as these books, and most importantly, there's a wide public concern to prevent these commemorative events having a baneful effect. It has been argued that a reason for the careful handling of these events is a suspicion that 50 years ago, similar anniversaries helped to light the fuse for the Troubles. However, besides that, many have come to value and learn from the more conciliatory manner in which these events have been marked to date. Hopefully, this will help people deal sensitively with the parts of our history in which there is no agreement or sense of shared history. It is critical that we respect different viewpoints and narratives. It will also be necessary to understand and acknowledge how the violence of this time affected not just the members of one's own community, but also the members of other communities. I want to turn to events in the summer of 1920, especially affecting this area. We have already received 2 very interesting papers on this subject, and I will add just a couple of comments. First, we have heard how after the murder on the 17th of July 1920 in Cork, Lieutenant Colonel Gerard Smith, his funeral in his hometown of Banbridge led to riots in the town and elsewhere. In early June, Smith had been appointed Divisional Commander of the RIC for Munster. Between January 1920 and Smith's death, over 40 members of the RIC had been killed, especially in Munster. On the 19th of June 1920, he visited the RIC station in Listowel, where he urged tough action against the IRA. One of those present, Constable Jeremiah Mee, objected to Smith's words, which he interpreted as saying that the police could kill with impunity. Smith ordered Mee's arrest, which the others refused to carry out. 5 police officers resigned, including Mee, who afterwards joined the Republican movement. Several weeks later, a report of this event, based on Mee's account, appeared in the press, causing great public outcry. This allegation led to Smith's death on the 17th of July in Cork. It should be noted, however, that Smith emphatically denied that he'd used the words ascribed to him. Indeed, his orders to the police included his strong opposition to police reprisals. His version of events was read out in Parliament 10 days after his death. Subsequently, District Inspector John M. Regan was asked to reorganise the barracks at Listowel. Later he wrote about Smith, and I quote, "I knew him when he was in the army in Limerick, and I would greatly doubt if his words were intended to convey the meaning attributed to them. And the fact that the police in the station were alleged to have practically mutinied afterwards makes their version extremely doubtful." However, Smith was now a marked man. I'd like to make another comment regarding events in Lisburn in August 1920. Those terrible days have been forgotten or ignored until recently. Thanks to Pierce Lawler's book and talk, we can appreciate the horror of what happened. District Inspector Swansea's murder sparked off riots over 3 days, with loyalist Protestant mobs attacking first the premises of Sinn Féin supporters, then the premises of all Catholics, and finally other properties. Hundreds of Catholics were forced to flee the town. Fortunately, there were only 2 deaths, Swansea and another unknown person whose unidentified body was found in a burnt-out factory. It is worth noting, I believe, that some people tried to stop this violence. When the rioting began, the Reverend J.B. Bradshaw, a curate at the cathedral, and other clergy sought to restrain the crowd, but without success. On Monday, the shooting happened on the Sunday, this is the next day on the Monday. On Monday, a meeting of clergy and other citizens convened by Canon W.B. Carmody was held in the cathedral schoolhouse. It was addressed by H.B. Swansea, cousin of District Inspector Swansea and Vicar of Newry. He said that the mother and sister of Swansea, who lived with him in Lisburn, were very anxious that what was going on should stop. Those present formed a peace patrol, which went onto the streets but had no impact on the rioters. The Reverend Swansea stood in a box in Market Square to urge an end to the rioting, but was ignored. Later, Swansea's mother and sister issued a message to the public. They issued a statement to deplore, and what they said was the destruction and loss which has befallen Lisburn. They stated they wish, through the press, to say how truly sorry they are that any person should have suffered any sorrow or loss on account of him. It would have been a real grief to him that anyone should suffer pain or loss of any kind on his behalf. These events can be viewed usefully in their political context. The late 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed the emergence of a clear political divide in Ireland between unionists based most strongly in Ulster and nationalists based throughout Ireland, both sides with strong denominational links. They were divided over the national question, with nationalists wanting some form of self-government, home rule, and unionists wanting to maintain the links, full links with Great Britain. The nationalist and unionist parties failed to reach a compromise on the national question. This led to the formation of opposing armed forces in the shape of the Ulster Volunteer Force and the Irish National Volunteers. After the 1916 Rising, there was a rise in support for a more advanced form of Irish self-government. In 1918, Sinn Féin became the dominant nationalist party, and the following year saw the beginning of the War of Independence, fought by the IRA against Crown forces. While Ulster did not experience the same level of violence as in Munster, Belfast saw violent riots in the summer of 1920. Following Smith's death in July 1920 and Swansea's death in August 1920, riots spread to Belfast with the expulsion of many Catholics from their places of work. Deaths numbered some 90 people over this period. More deaths followed in following months. At Westminster, efforts to find a political solution resulted in the Government of Ireland Act of December 1920, which partitioned Ireland into two political entities. Given the confrontation between Unionists and Sinn Féin nationalists, there was no realistic alternative to partition in 1920. This was a compromise welcomed by Northern Unionists, but not by Northern Nationalists or Republicans. The Act created Northern Ireland based on the 6 northeast counties of Ulster. On the 22nd of June, King George conducted the official opening of the Northern Ireland Parliament in a ceremony at Belfast City Hall. Nationalists and Republicans did not attend the new Parliament and boycotted some government departments and agencies. The first 5 months of 1922 witnessed great violence in Northern Ireland. The IRA, with the support of Michael Collins and the new Southern government, mounted a concerted armed campaign against the state. 2 Unionist MPs, Sir Henry Wilson and William Twaddell, were murdered. Between December 1921 and the end of May 1922, there was much violence in Belfast, with an estimated 236 deaths, which disproportionately affected the Catholic population. Opinions differ, but we can note Jonathan Barden's reckoning that between July 1920 and July 1922, the death toll in the 6 counties was 557, including 303 Catholics, 172 Protestants, and 82 members of the security forces. During 1922, sectarian violence included the murders of 6 members of the Catholic McMahon family in Belfast and 6 Presbyterians at Altnavay, County Armagh. Disbandment of the RIC and the creation of the RUC only in June 1922 meant the Ulster Special Constabulary, especially the B Specials established in late 1920, played an important, if controversial, role in the defence of the state. Some 43 members of the Ulster Special Constabulary were killed. Tough emergency laws were enacted to deal with the security situation. Internment was introduced. The violence had mostly ended by late June 1922, due in part to divisions in Republican ranks of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which led to a civil war in the south, which lasted until May 1923. The situation here, I believe, can be usefully set in a comparative context. After the First World War, other states were established in Central and Eastern Europe. Many, like Northern Ireland, contained majorities in favour of these arrangements and minorities opposed to them. They resembled Northern Ireland in lacking homogeneity in relation especially to national identity and also religion and language. So our situation was not unusual. Silesia was another place of contested borders between Poland and Germany, which saw great violence, much more than in Northern Ireland, as Tim Wilson has shown. Only 2/3 of the population of Poland spoke Polish, while Czechoslovakia contained large numbers of Sudeten Germans. The new Irish Free State also experienced such minority challenges. It had 2 minorities, in fact, to deal with. First, there was its Protestant population, most of whom were Unionist or Loyalist in their politics. That was one significant minority now in the new Irish Free State. Between 1911 and 1926, their numbers dropped from 10% to 7.4% of the population, a fall of 34%. This decline was partly due to the departure of army personnel and First World War dead. Another important factor was violence against members of this community, which forced many thousands to leave during the War of Independence, but mostly in the 2 years after the Treaty of July 1921. In the past, their plight was usually ignored in both political and Church of Ireland histories. Recently, work by Peter Hart, Gemma Clark, and Robin Bury has cast new light on their experiences. By 1926, every county in the Irish Free State had witnessed the fall of at least 20% of its Protestant populations since 1911. The Irish Free State, however, had a second minority of significance. Both the new Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State governments faced armed opposition arising from division over national identity. This challenge for the Southern government, however, did not come from the Protestant minority, whose leaders declared their support for the new state. It arose because a minority rejected the Anglo-Irish Treaty for not delivering a republic. This treaty was voted for by a Dáil majority and endorsed at the 1922 general election, a verdict which an anti-treaty minority refused to accept. A civil war ensued, which led to great loss of life, probably around 1500. The Irish government took strong steps to deal with this crisis, even tougher than in the north. When Republicans murdered a TD and threatened others, the Irish cabinet ordered the summary execution of 4 Republican prisoners. There's no question that these men were guilty for the murder. They had the ultimate alibi. They were all in jail. But the cabinet signed an order for their execution as a warning about that sort of thing happening. And I have to say, there were no more TDs murdered after this. But these are the tough times that we're talking about. The South's special emergency powers included the death penalty for the possession of arms, which was not the case in the North. Both governments used internment. In Northern Ireland, an estimated 728 internees were held between May 1922 and the end of 1924. While in the Irish Free State, by February 1923, according to Dermot Ferreter, there were some 13,000 Republican prisoners and internees in the Irish Free State. Let me conclude. These years, 1920 to 23, were a tumultuous and violent period, not only here, but also in other places, as I have recorded. 100 years on, we were seeking to recall, to mark, and to commemorate these events. Fortunately, there are a number of valuable, previously published and new historical works which will help us get at the facts, which is very important. Lecture series such as this run by Lisburn Museum have an important role in examining our history. Of course, there will be debate among historians and the public on these issues, but that is all part of the world of history, research and writing. Hopefully, there will be occasions for an inclusive commemoration of events. At the same time, some people will wish to commemorate certain events and not others. That's fine. But we should appreciate that there are different viewpoints and narratives, and we must respect this. There will be a tendency to recall especially the sufferings of members of our own community. But we must understand that other communities also suffered. All victims should be remembered. Future anniversaries and commemorations will present great challenges to us, not only in Northern Ireland, but also in the Republic, where people will have to deal with the civil war, which will be a very difficult matter. 50 years ago, commemorative events were a source of rancor and confrontation. things have changed greatly. In the first part of my talk, I spoke of how recently we've been able to experience and take comfort from shared history. The spirit of goodwill this has engendered, and the more mature and balanced approach we've been able to take to our history, leads me to be hopeful for the future. Thanks to this, and thanks to current efforts to deal with ongoing anniversaries, I believe that we will be able to deal successfully with the final years of our decade of centenaries. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Brian, for such a fantastic overview. We're going to open the floor up for questions now. Give people some time to get them together. I think you could maybe start a book club, because there's a few people interested in some of the titles you mentioned this evening.
Yes.
And I wonder if we could perhaps email them out.
Yes, by all means. Yes, by all means.
The books
yes.
that you mentioned. I think that'd be great. I wonder if maybe I could start. So you mentioned that commemoration matters. That it actually makes a difference. It fosters healing, perhaps makes people feel better. It gives them better understanding. Do you think that's a popular notion, more commemoration in Ireland? We asked Pierce last time we were here if he thought it would be a good idea to have a monument to the victims of the Swansea riots, and he was adamant that no, he wouldn't. He didn't think that was necessary. There's enough commemoration in Ireland. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think we should be careful about commemorations. An interesting article by Stephen Collins in the Irish Times last week dealt with this. He was concerned that in the South there had been a lot of commemorations of events to do with the War of Independence, and he's concerned that some of these commemorations were giving a very black and white picture, and he thought that they were also extolling violence in a manner that he thought was very unfortunate. So I think we have to be careful about these commemorations. We have to be measured in them and avoid the danger of getting overexcited by such events. Now, we've been able to enjoy a good deal of respect for these matters, and I hope that will continue. I was very encouraged by what happened about the events a week ago, with commemoration of events at Croke Park, when British forces were responsible for the death of some dozen citizens in Croke Park. This followed the murder by the IRA of another 10 members or so of British Army officers in Dublin that morning. I was impressed by what happened. There was a dignified memorial for this event in Croke Park. But then President Higgins made some very good points. He said we should be remembering today not just those in Croke, we should remember the 32 people who died. He made that point very strongly. And he said we should realize that there are other people on this island who will have different understandings of these events, and we should bear that in mind. He said that, and Doug Beattie, then an Ulster Unionist MLA, tweeted on that subject and congratulated President Higgins for making that inclusive speech and thanked him for it. So I think that was very positive.
Okay. That's great. Just waiting for a few more questions to come through. Something we were talking about before the stream started was some controversy earlier on in this year, in a life before COVID. There's a controversy about commemoration of the RIC. I wonder, do you have any thoughts on what went wrong there? Why, when that was first mooted, it didn't go down so well?
Well, it seems to have been handled badly and announced in such a way that it took us by surprise, and it engendered hostility that allowed the whole thing to collapse. I think very unfortunate, because that really was a key moment to test people's attitude towards events at this time, to try and take a more inclusive view, because of course the members of the RIC, the regular members of the RIC were all Irishmen, and many felt it was important that they be commemorated. But I think there'll be other attempts to remember them. It's just unfortunate the way things grew up, and people hurled in comments that just causes great controversy, and the whole event had to be wound down then, which I think was a great pity.
Yeah. Okay. Are there any, you've mentioned it a wee bit, but are there any commemorative events that you think were pitched really well and helped us take a step forward?
Well, I'm not sure about that. I mean, there may well be events that come along that we'll want to commemorate. Of course, if I may remember, you have a talk on the Spanish flu, which is quite interesting. 2018, what happened. Important to remember that. I have a personal interest in that, actually. I should have mentioned this, that I discovered only quite recently that my grandfather died in October 1918, and that never dawned on me. He was a man only aged about 50, and yet he died quite young. So I've been contacting my relatives to find out, did he die from the Spanish flu? They haven't been able to tell me anything. His death certificate didn't mention it, but that's something that I'm interested in as well. That flu was something that struck all communities and was a terrible event, and it's one that we're well worth recalling today. But I think for many people there will be things they'll want to mark, whether it's tragedies that have occurred to their community or people they think have acted valiantly and bravely, and they should do so and should show some respect. I was quite interested, Micheál Martin, Taoiseach and Fianna Fáil leader, was asked about commemorating establishment of Northern Ireland, and he said he was happy to be involved in such a celebration, in such an anniversary. He was, of course, a Republican. He didn't agree with partition, but nonetheless, it was important to show respect to one's neighbours, and that's what he would be quite happy to do.
There's a comment here from Eileen Brady, and she notes that I think that the potential RIC commemoration mixed up the general RIC with the black and tans and the auxiliaries.
Yes, I think that was one of the problems, because the changes that were brought in meant that these other forces were drafted in the auxiliaries, and the black and tans, I think they all technically were part of the RIC, and that's what given them a bad name. I think that added to the problem.
Absolutely. Gerard Fole has asked that how can Professor Walker be optimistic about the coming commemoration when Michelle O'Neill and presumably those she speaks for see nothing to celebrate in the centenary of Northern Ireland?
Well, I hope they will move from that. They don't have to celebrate it, but they can acknowledge it and they can pay respect. I was very impressed by what Arlene Foster did. She completely disagreed with the 1916 Rising, but she was prepared to go to Dublin. She was prepared to attend a talk on the subject and listen to it with respect. And I think that's the way people will have to try and deal with these matters.
Okay, just last call for any other questions. I'm just going to jump in with a question about the NS Centenary. Because we're on the eve of it, next year, I think towards April, May, there'll start to be moves to mark, and I think that's the language that's being used, mark over celebrate. Is there anything that's causing you concern? You've mentioned optimism. Is there anything that, is a proverbial canary in the coal mine that's a warning sign to you?
Well, I suppose it will involve some controversy, and we've got to try and deal with that as best we can. But these problems are not just for us. The Irish state is going to have a real problem with these events as well in their own jurisdiction. For example, the establishment of the Irish Free State. We now have a Fianna Fáil government, but their ancestors in 1921 were totally opposed to that Irish Free State. So how are they going to deal with that? Mm-hmm. Then there's the Civil War. Over 1,500 deaths, and these weren't caused by black and tans, they were caused by other Irishmen. So it's going to be extremely difficult. But returning to our own case, I just hope people will show tolerance, will show respect, the state was established in 1921 amid great difficulties. Other states had great difficulties, but in spite of that, we're now 100 years on and we have survived, and I think that's something we should be proud of.
That's great, thanks very much. So if there's no more questions there, I'll keep an eye on that there. I just want to thank you again for your talk tonight. It was really interesting. Oh, we do have a question. So Paul has said, you said the pro-treaty approach to the Civil War was even tougher than the response in the North. Would you say that the 1920 to 22 violence here was mainly a response to the threat against the state?
The violence in?
Presumably in the North.
Well, there was violence against the state by the IRA. There was also sectarian violence. And both these factors are important for causing the death. And what we see is this unfortunate picture of violence leading to more violence. And I do think these two factors are important. One, the IRA and its campaign against the state, and secondly, sectarian violence.
Okay, a few more questions in. Alison Martin, historian, said, what needs to be done in order to ensure that the Irish Civil War is commemorated in a fair and balanced way?
Well, that's a real challenge. I've no ideas about it, I'm afraid. And I wish, well, the historians in Dublin who are trying to do that.
There's a comment there from Barry O'Donnell. I'm not sure I can see a question there, but perhaps we'll finish on Greg Harrison, who says, many thanks to Professor Walker for a really interesting and thought-provoking lecture. Seems like a nice way to end.
Thank you very much.
So I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight. We hope to see you in the new year, 7th of January. And we're joined by Dr. Cormac Moore, who's going to discuss the partition of Ireland and some of its implications for law, sport, agriculture. Really interesting taking things. So thank you all. Good night, and I hope you have a happy and peaceful Christmas. Thank you.
Thank you.